All right. Podcast number 2 for 2020.
It's a long way, isn't it? We've come a long way. In how long have we been doing this podcast? Doesn't seem
6,
like
7
long
months?
At all. No, what? Really?
Well, by the time this is released, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Right now, I think 5 months, but... That's how organised we are.
You are an extremely organised man. You are thinking a year in advance already, and I just gave you a huge lecture in the last podcast about how you should plan your life in advance. Me sitting here, how long has this been? 5 months, bullshit.
I am very methodical and organised. Although that's sometimes worked against me. I struggle to live in the moment. What a robotic thing to say. I struggle to live in the moment and have what you humans call as fun.
And also very good at maths.
Yeah.
Look, man.
But that is like the Indian and Asian mindset. Become a robot.
It is.
Just be really good at maths.
But you get shit done.
Yeah. We're going to save the world.
No, I really believe that.
Well, China, I don't know about India, but China.
Yeah, China's not doing. They're really not pulling their weight, but China's plowing ahead.
Yeah.
And I do think it is that. It's because they train their society to be very intelligent ants. That's cool.
That's it, isn't it? That's exactly it. And that's the perfect segue into my chosen topic for this podcast. Group identity. Yeah.
That is the perfect segue.
Group identity. Yes. We're all just part of a colony of ants. Well, we are. We really are.
I know this.
We're all just part of multiple colonies. Now, there's no real opinion I have on group identity. I just want to examine and explore the topic because it's so relevant to the comedy I put out there. It's so relevant to just the way I think at the moment, and it's...
Why?
I've just been observing it a lot lately in the way, the culturescape is at the moment. People talk about identity politics and all that sort of thing, and I used to use that term a lot as a way to dismiss the SJWs. But really this is your area of expertise. All politics is identity politics. It's based on some form of shared identity and commonalities among various groups and tribes competing against other groups and tribes for their interest.
It is really unfortunate. Well, it has its pluses and minuses, but I think it depends on how you orchestrate those. But essentially, what you're saying is just like human beings. It is inescapable that when you have more than two of them, it becomes culture. And culture just naturally starts becoming, I don't know, I guess like there's some parts of every individual together. So it's not just politics, is it? Everything is culture.
Yeah, okay.
As soon as you get away from an individual level, but even when you get to the individual level, it's so influenced by culture.
But do you think when I talk about group identity, do you think that's just synonymous with culture, or do you think culture is sort of that's one aspect of group identity?
No, actually, you know what? I think group identity is probably a more precise definition of it. Probably shouldn't use the word culture, but something. Look, tribalism, identity, that kind of stuff. It's all kind of interlinked, and it's this idea is
we can't escape it. It's intrinsic to us as Homo sapiens.
It is.
A big takeout I took from that the Sapiens book was. Neanderthals actually had a larger brain than Homo sapiens, and it's not conclusive, but there's evidence that suggests their computational ability and their IQ was actually higher than the average Homo sapien. But the reason Homo sapiens eventually won the Darwinian race was because we were able to organize and conduct ourselves in groups and in tribes through shared symbols or whatever that may be, shared ideas.
It's imagination.
Yeah, abstract thinking.
Right, yeah.
And, well, a lot of, whether it's in the sphere of politics or just general social commentary, so many people now have this idea, they'll say, I'm a free thinker, I'm an individual. No, you're not.
Are you?
No one is. No one, really, I thought it, because I used to say that, like, I'm not left or right, I'm a free thinker. But that in itself is a tribe. Don't you think? The free thinking tribe.
Yes.
That becomes a tribe, and then you
Yes.
have a bias towards other people who are free thinkers, and you're more interested in the goals of that particular community. So then it just becomes a group identity anyway.
Well, this is what I'm saying, is that there are group identities that are much more useful.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of like orchestrating which of those cultures or identities is the ones that you should be focusing on.
Yeah.
So for instance, like really good example of this is the US. Because the US is a nation of immigrants, they couldn't make their identity. So say if you go to a country like India, a lot of the culture will just be around like we're Hindu or we're
Sure.
Muslim. A lot of it is very religious.
Well, America
based.
used to be like that.
Used to be
Actually,
like that.
every country used to be like that.
Yes, it used to be a lot more. We're a Christian nation. That was a huge part of their identity. But what happened when they started moving in immigrants was to try and make the entire society collectively work. The overall narrative was we are Americans. And that's why you see so much patriotism interlaced into American society, is because of something that started, I think, in the 40s.
Right.
It was a long time ago that they really started pushing that narrative there. In Australia, not so much.
That
Like our
patriotism
narrative,
didn't exist prior to that.
it existed, but it wasn't in the same way. It's
Well,
like,
America was always built upon the ideas of individual freedom, and was it?
well, see, that's the myth that's happened now. But like if you go to say Pilgrim times,
Yeah.
no, like the myth, what built their identity was Christianity.
Sure.
And so there was an overlay of that. And so, the founding forefathers might have been trying to lace that in to make justify the fact they weren't part of the British Empire anymore.
Yeah, well, I suppose the counter argument to that was, that it was a Christian nation, but the individual freedom aspect was more in terms of the government.
Which is another thing that they seem to prize so strongly. And again, it's because that culture was pushed, that we are a nation of individuals. Whereas in other cultures, like in China and stuff, it's like this idea of a collective.
That becomes a collective. That's what I'm trying to say. That becomes a
Yes.
collective.
So which one's more useful is the whole point, right? Like, it's just like, yes, okay, so you are saying, because I will argue this to the cows come home, and you just said, for instance, that I'm not left or right, I'm an individual thinker.
No,
Yes,
I
there might be
used
an
to say
identity
that.
Okay, but the thing is that, well, what else? How else would you describe? See, this is the thing now. Like, I do like this where you're going from, because I honestly think exactly the same thing, and I've noticed a lot recently, is that as soon as you start identifying as things, you actually make yourself stupider. If that's a word.
Yeah. Perfect example right here.
I figured.
Yeah, you do, because then you just subconsciously you inherit a bias towards that particular identity.
Yes.
And you're not able to objectively look at anything. But the thing is, no matter what, that's going to be the case. You're going to have a bias towards whatever group identity you consider yourself to be a part of. So the question to me now isn't about, I used to think, how can I best avoid a tribal mentality? How can I best not fall for group biases? But now it's more about, how do I choose the right groups for me, and the best group identity or identities to be able to conduct as high quality a life as I can. I think that's what people should also be thinking about as well.
And I think that actually makes a lot of sense. I think that that's probably the way that you're going to... Because, again, it's all these things of just like, once you start adopting... Because what is culture, or what is identity at the end of the day? Really, it's a principle of value. It's a set of values that you're buying into.
Shared experiences can really develop, can foster a sense of group identity. So you spoke about 1940s American things like that. The national identity of a lot of Western countries is definitely it's gone down. People don't see themselves as you and I would still see ourselves as Australian, but what does that even mean? There are probably other groups that we adhere to that have much more value to us than the idea of being Australian.
Yeah, it's a very, very weak identity of what Australia is.
It never used, but, well, I don't know, because I never lived 100 years ago, but...
No, because back then, that's what
is...
they thought. They thought of themselves as subjects of the British Empire.
Yeah, and that too. And well, being part of things like when you were subject to a world war, that would foster an incredible sense of kinship among all the people, regardless of any other minor differences within a population. When you're all having that shared experience of the fear and the patriotism and the wanting to survive, that would then create a really strong sense of group identity. But that
Yes.
doesn't happen on a national level anymore.
No.
There aren't experiences that we all have in the country of Australia. Well, they probably are, but they're very minute compared to what they used to.
Which is a lot of our job, really. Is you know what? A lot of our job is just identifying what these, cultural tropes are.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's broken. Just leave it. Yeah.
Um,
So I've just done this web series, and this sort of brought this idea to my mind. It's called Crossing the Line, and what I did was myself and Team Array, we wrote a little plug there. Subtle. We wrote a series of jokes that would get progressively more offensive on any given topic. So we just released, the first episode was Muslim jokes, for example, and a comedian would deliver them to a person. Either they'd just be sitting on the couch by themselves, or they'd be sitting as a duo. And what happened is when they all came in as strangers, you could in that first discussion. But after the set, they'd all participate in a discussion. So they all came in with their unique group identity, and they were very separate. You could just tell they were very combative that first discussion, and they wanted to butt heads, and they wanted to stand up for what they saw as their group identity. But then, I think what happened is, I wouldn't say it was an extremely moving experience, but there were points where people were crying and they were sharing emotional stories and, talking about themselves in a deep way. And that fostered a sense of unity among that group. And I think they actually became a tribe by that last episode. The way they discussed, the way they would still debate certain jokes, for example, but you could tell it was in a much more, I wouldn't say civil way, but it was in a very it was in an empathetic way, because I think that shared experience allowed them to have that sense of group identity amongst themselves.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So you think that they created a group within the span of how long?
2 days.
2 days.
I think they did, yeah.
Doesn't that say a lot?
Think about that. If you go on a camp or something, or you go on a big hike or some sort of challenging experience, and you share that with 5 or 6 other people, even if it is a day, there's gonna be a sense of connection between all the people who went through that one experience.
The corporate world is obsessed with that, aren't they? Just
team
building
team
exercises.
Bonding. Yeah,
that was a team building exercise.
Yeah, but it comes from a place of truth, like that.
Yeah,
that is very team building.
And I think it's also the other thing is that you gave them a common goal.
Yeah.
So they had something to focus on as a group.
And then, I always used to think about hazing rituals at universities and think that it's just so barbaric. What are they doing? But I can understand some of the ideas behind it, because what they're doing is, I've always wondered, I wonder if hazing rituals sort of developed organically, or there was some, I don't know, the dean or some person sort of just said, this is what we're going to do to foster a sense of community among these people. I think they just developed organically, and they just evolved as a mechanism to allow that particular group of people to bond.
I think it's intuitive, but I also think that it has something to do with military academies. I think
Sure.
that would have been an offshoot of that.
Yeah, and even that, yeah. So you take sort of the process when it's a new cadet or whatever, and they like break them down. I don't know exactly, but from what I from what I've seen, they're very brutal to them in those first few weeks and months of being in the military. And that is, I think when that unit of people experience that same, suffering and are moved to that extent through this challenging experience, that just amplifies the sense of unity among them.
Yeah.
Because if a group of people go and do, like, just go on a walk, for example, yeah, maybe they'll develop some level of kinship, but when it's a marathon, or when it's the more arduous the experience, the greater the sense of group identity that will develop from it, I think.
But there's also the other element of that's a classic trait of brainwashing.
Yeah. Expand.
It's like if you keep breaking people down in a group, this is what, some like the classic example, I guess, is Jonestown, putting them out in the middle of he deliberately did this. He moved an entire population of American citizens to South America and made them create a society in South America. Now, part of that was because of his paranoia, but another part was that he was a master manipulator, and he knew the dynamics of groups and how they worked.
Yeah.
And so he knew that if you put them in the middle of South America, life would be really hard. And so they would have to develop their own culture, and so as a result of them developing their own culture, and he's influencing that culture, he gets to break down how they think.
Okay.
And because they're just like in that state of, it's this thing of just like, a state of total exhaustion, being moved out into an environment that they're not used to. I mean, that is what the military does. It brainwashes you into, and I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, but it's just, it's brainwashing you into a certain way of thinking that makes you much more compliant and, just ready to take orders, because that is the most important part of a military operation. Because you do, again, have to think like ants. Otherwise, you are not going to be as organized as your opponents.
Of course, yeah. If there's one rogue operative who just, no, I want to do it this way.
Yeah.
The whole unit's going to die.
Grenade pin now.
Yeah. Because that's interesting. I've never heard of that before, but...
that's what
What is it common is the suffering. Like, what happens in the military academy is they go through really tough conditions, and it's that suffering that amplifies the attachment to whatever the identity or the culture is.
Yes.
And that's
because you start relying on other people as well.
Yeah, and that's why I think ideologies are more... Like, people who are suffering are more prone to fall prey to ideologies.
No, that makes heaps of sense. You hear that all the time from people who join cults.
Yeah.
They find like a sense of belonging. So that's actually a really interesting way that you look at it, which is that, like what groups are best, what groups best serve me.
Yeah. Because then it's also a value hierarchy of, if you say, okay, this is, number one, I'm an Australian, for example. You value that above all the other groups. Or number one, I'm a family man. Then you value your family above. Number one, I'm a family man. Number two, I'm an Australian. So then if there was ever a choice where you had to choose between family or country, you'd choose family. So how do you... the thing I'm thinking about now is, how do you come up with that hierarchy, and what are the methods to employ to make those judgments? Or does it happen organically and we don't actually have any control over it?
No, I think that, yes, you are going to be a lot more susceptible to these things than you could hope for, but at least being aware of them, as always, leaves you to being less of prey, I guess, to ideas and identities that are hitting them. Because this is what I always noticed with, the whole SJW-based argument. And now the whole thing is that argument has become so tired, but there was a point where everybody online was hitting one of those sides, right? They just moved into whichever of those sides they were, and...
I think it's still there, man.
It's still there, but have you noticed that the culture is shifting? Have you noticed that it's no longer about... because a lot of that was just based, at the end of the day, on... it was based a lot on, like, race and gender. Now, I think that what's happening is it's moving towards generation. Because don't you think that is the biggest meme of this year? Is okay, boomer. It's millennials versus boomers. I see that as being much more... It's what's happening in terms of unifying.
I don't know, man. There's still a lot of millennials who would call themselves "I'm anti-SJW" and
Of course,
that sort
I'm
of
saying
thing.
that like the culture's there,
Yeah,
but that was a long meme. That lasted a long
sure.
time. That was probably, what were we talking about before? Maybe starting in like 2014, 2015.
I would say it sort of developed around then. Yeah.
I think the boomer meme started, I guess, with the 30-year-old boomer thing, which was just maybe in 2018, 2017, maybe.
Yeah.
But it's this kind of like, these things take a long time to expand, but I'm noticing over and over again, what I would see before in the comments was a lot of cucks, racist, transphobic, all that crap, right?
Okay, now it's more boomer.
And now it's more just like, this content's boomer. Like, that'll be the,
Yeah,
the main
right.
insult.
Yeah,
And so I
interesting.
think that what is happening is that the generation, and I don't know why this is starting to unify under the idea that we are young, as opposed to who's a racist and who's not a racist. You know, like it's
Yeah.
I think that this is where society is moving.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. I think right now it hasn't gotten to the point that the SJW and anti-SJW
No, absolutely not.
dichotomy got to.
But don't you think that
It
it's
could,
feeling
though.
stale? I mean, look, I think that one of the main
For
things
us,
that's
it
great
is.
about
Yeah,
yes,
because we've been in that world for so long. But for so many people, I think that only came into their consciousness in maybe 2017. And it probably peaked then. But yeah, I'd say it's going down.
I think, and this is not really a reflection on our intelligence or anything, but I think it's just because as comedians, as we're just saying, we a lot of our job is just observing societal trends.
Sure.
So I think in a lot of ways we're sort of not futurists, presentists. We're just constantly trying to paint a picture of what society's like at that point.
Sure.
So I think that because we're actually hypersensitive to exactly what you're talking about, which is tribes, and identifying what those tribes are and commenting on those tribes.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of being a comedian. It's
But
a
then
lot of
what-
the bread and butter jokes.
But what you're doing, see, what we're doing there is we're unifying over that group identity of being a comedian.
which is a
It's
lot of
everywhere.
the reason that we bond.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of it. And you know what else is something that I think is amazing that has been noticed in a book that I was reading years ago now, which is that, like what you were saying, how there was that unifying experience of, say, World War I or World War II. Our generation's unifying experience was The Simpsons. That was our war. Isn't that insane?
Yeah,
because
it was.
everybody can sit there and just say, I don't know, for instance, no, my son is also named Bort. And that will be like them being like, yeah, so are you in Tobruk? Yeah, 49th Battalion. That is our unifier.
Oh my God.
Weird, isn't it? But at the same time, pretty cool. And it makes
Is
a
it?
lot of sense. There's two ways of
They
looking
fought
at
a
that.
war. We watched an animation series.
I mean, yeah, it shows that we like, because that is something that they're always talking about. You know, oh, snowflakes.
That's
bunch of
why
buttercups.
we'll never beat the boomers because
Yeah,
whatever
we don't have the
sense
gristle.
of group identity they've developed over going through. Well, they didn't actually go through the war. The greatest generation, whatever sense of identity they developed through going through a war. I mean, the amount of people that died and
war.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
even that they probably would have experienced the Great Depression. Like that generation truly must really have a strong sense of connection to each other.
Yeah.
They endured a lot. Whereas boomers, I mean, what did they endure?
Vietnam.
The
They
PTSD
didn't wanna
of
go
their
to that.
parent from the war. That's what they
More of them were beaten than us.
They did go. No, Vietnam was and the
Yeah,
cold
but
the
fuck all of
Cold
them
War.
win. Yeah, they had the Cold War, so
Had
they
the
had that
Cold War.
looming fear of
Yeah.
nuclear Armageddon.
Yeah, and so that would have really a common enemy is that's where group identity and I mean everyone knows that, but you really the older I get, the more I just understand how powerful the idea of a common enemy is.
Of course.
Because the most vocal and effective tribes, even if the ones we've been talking about over the last couple of years, say the if you call SJWs, even though there's so many little subgroups there, but their common enemy was
the racists.
the racists.
Yeah.
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 So they do whatever it takes to defeat the racists, and then the anti-SJWs. Their common enemy is the SJWs. And they do whatever it takes to beat them. And then these the free. I'm a free thinker. Their common enemy are the extremes of either side. So they do whatever it takes to defeat the extremes. So everywhere there's a common enemy.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is like very important, is trying to determine what the common enemy is. That is a really important motivator of how your society is going to be shaped, or how your culture is going to be shaped. Yeah. And the thing is that you actually have power over that. Even in your small circle of friends, you can, just by the ideas that you bring into it, you are shaping that small little micro culture.
Yeah.
And so these things, I think that is how memes work. And that's, dude, memes are little snippets of culture. They're little snippets of identity.
Yeah.
And that's how you can kind of determine how our generation at least communicates with each other. And a big part of that, I think, is that when you see, because this is why I think it's become so unified against boomers, and that joke is starting to grow, is because you know what we are? We're kind of like African animals at this point when it comes to the net. In the real world, we're pathetic. But like on the net, we have become... because we grew up in it, I guess, just like how cheetahs are really fast and have huge claws, and then you come to somewhere like Australia and there's just kangaroos and, you know, some snakes. Ooh, you know, there's all these animals that just haven't had that hotbed of competition.
Okay, yeah.
And so I think that's actually, like, on a really nerdy incel sort of way, that's what's happened on the net. Is that, like, because there was that whole thing of just like SJWs versus the based guys, like that.
So all the times the millennials have been shut down in the comment section, they've learned from that.
They've learned from it.
They've mutated.
Yes.
They've evolved.
Have you ever seen a comment section against boomers and that? Look, dude, it is a cheetah versus a tortoise. There's no chance. You know, like, it's
getting better, but they'll never, because our brains were still forming. We were in our teenage years when we were exposed to the net. So we developed our cognitive abilities with the net.
Yeah,
so
we were born in it and
always have an
raised in it.
advantage there. But as soon as if the internet ever shut down, boomers would just kill us.
Of course. Yeah, they have the life skills
Gen
and
X.
the money.
Yeah.
But
we'd kill Gen Z.
Oh man, yeah, they're pretty puss, aren't they? That's true. It's a nice flexing over someone.
By the way, I've been looking at our iTunes reviews. I looked at one, and it was a 5 star. It was good. It was like, this is a really good podcast. Just stop saying puss.
No, absolutely not. These are your options, mate. You can either stop watching this, or you get exposed. You just have to get immune to puss.
I assume it was one of the female listeners. Oh, yeah, it could be a man that's like, oh, I don't like that word.
My girlfriend does hate me saying puss.
Oh,
she
yeah.
despises it. And look, this is one thing that
It's
you've got to learn about
uncomfortable word
guys.
for women, isn't it?
It is, but like you have to learn something about this, all right? Like,
It is.
if you say that, it's not going to stop. It's going to be exacerbated times 10. It's like the bushfires, man.
Yeah.
You just got to let it burn out by itself. You can't put water on this. It's too big.
Well, that actually is a really interesting point. Do you think, not only men, but certain groups have an inherently rebellious streak in them? So when you look at teenage boys, for example, they just want whatever the teacher is telling them to do. They want to do the opposite.
Bosses.
So when whatever culture you're trying to bestow upon the teenagers, they are going to actually rebel and do the opposite. I mean, you look at in the 60s when there was the Cultural Revolution. Do you think that part of that was because there was so much Christianity and conservative values forced upon them, so they just naturally rebelled? Whereas now there's all this like alt-right meme culture because of all the like, well, yeah, for the want of a better phrase, SJW culture that is forced upon teenage boys.
No, that is exactly what happened. But it's also, and they are completely oblivious to it as well, because my girlfriend, because she's acting now, she goes to a lot of plays, and all these plays are written by boomers, and they're just getting onto it now. Every play that you see is, why is the net so angry? And they answer their own question, because they just keep going back to those tropes of homophobic, sexist, racist, because I feel like our generation is sort of evolving past that point. It's just, it's losing its edge, but it's not losing its edge to the boomers. And I think that, again, this is like a whole thing about
Interesting.
what are the influences on your culture, what is happening to it, what is the general thought, which is what I think is very interesting about ours. Yes, like with everything else, there is a lot of engineering about these identities. So, for instance, Obama used to take huge pains and measures to constantly be, like, one of his most famous quotes is, there's not a right America and a left America. There's a United States of America. He was always trying to push that narrative.
Sure.
And that's just one element of it, right? There's all these different... Everybody's just trying to push it on
Those days are over, aren't they? I don't think that
Absolutely.
would be an effective political strategy now, would it?
Yeah, and Trump doesn't.
Yeah.
Trump doesn't push that narrative. He actually pushes the us versus them.
He does.
He does. He's and
Well, all of them have some form of none of the I don't know. You're a Bernie guy. Do you think he's pushing like the 1% is the them?
Yep. Because it's exactly what you said. And I remember realizing this when I really started getting into being a political YouTuber, I guess. There was a point where I just looked at my producer and I said, dude, you know what all politics is? It's just a story of who can tell who the enemy is better.
It's weaponized group identity.
It is. And that's exactly what... And that's why I think that actually Bernie Sanders is really onto a message that really... And that's why there's such a huge media blackout against him. But that there is not a more effective political message than that message, which has always historically been put down because, the elite are the ones that actually own the means of communication, right? So they can constantly be... And that's why I think a huge factor of the reason that all this SJW stuff happened, I honestly think it was because after the global financial crisis, what started appearing as the mainstream message was that it's the 1%'s fault. There was just that idea instilled into most people's minds. So the financial collapse was the result of... It was because of banks. It was because of banking mismanagement, and that freaked them out. And I think that what they did as a response to that was to start pushing this racism, sexism, transphobia narrative to make these groups disassemble and start fighting against each other, because it's not as focused enemy.
But how even with the power and resources that the billionaires in America have, how can they influence something like that? Just through the media, through what the media is talking about?
Well, see, this is the whole thing that I find very scary about it. And sorry, I know that every time I just go on to propaganda, but it is very linked to, obviously, like groups.
Sure, yeah.
But this is what's very scary about media, is that a lot of what you think is not because you have come to that conclusion. And as we were saying before, yes, a lot of that is family, religion, culture, background, whatever, but there is an underlying message that is constantly being pushed out, and it is from your television, your radio, your internet. And it's just like, what message is being pushed? What message is being pushed? And so if you look at like the big political channels on the net, one of them organically grew up, which is, I guess, the Young Turks, but Stephen Crowder didn't grow up organically. Lot of money in oil and cigarettes from that. Vox didn't grow up organically. Lot of money from banks. Now, what do Vox and Stephen Crowder talk about all the time? The culture war. It suits the billionaire class.
But the Young Turks talk about that
what?
as well, don't they?
Oh, absolutely they do. And I think, and what you're saying as well, right, that there is this, you're creating these cultures, and that's what I find very uncomfortable about watching the Young Turks, when they just start getting like all cuck. And so I start moving away from them, right? But as soon as they start talking about the banks again, man, I'm right back in.
Okay.
So I think it's just this thing of, if you look at it from every single media perspective, what are they pushing constantly? It is a culture war, and it has been happening in the 90s, say, when it comes to America, for instance, with quote-unquote conservative radio, your Rush Limbaugh's, Fox News, Michael Savage, all of these people. What they mostly have been talking about since the 90s is a culture war, that there is a war against Christmas, that there's a war against Christians, that there's there's anti-racism. They were the ones that started pushing that, and then I think what happened is that the other aisle, the media that is not controlled by oil so much as banks started pushing the, like, you're a racist, you're a sexist.
Do you think that's a concerted effort by banks to actually or the 1% to actually do something like that, or do you think it?
I know for a fact it is. I know for a fact it is.
Yeah.
Because I knew someone from Pedestrian. And, like, they were telling me that, and it was exactly what happened. Like, when I first came out in 2014, 2015, they were pushing my stuff a lot. They really liked the message that I was pushing. Yeah. Then they noticed that I didn't fit into the, the new face of whatever, like, the left. They decide what the left is again, why I hate those phrases of left and right, because it's just, it's arbitrary. You get to decide, someone else decides what it is, and everyone's just like, yeah. So, like, so then, the face of the left just became like, are you a racist and a sexist? And dude, I refuse to not make jokes about women or transsexuals or gay people, but I also make fun of bogans. I also make fun of, just like, you're up, like, the uptight white male.
Yeah.
It's just, that's being a comedian. You make fun of all sects of society.
For the purpose of this discussion, we could call it, the cultural left and the economic left, couldn't we?
Okay, well, yeah, let's just use that as a guiding point. But, like, under great pains and restraint, I say.
No, I know, I'm with you there. You can't help. You got to just use.
You have to do it when you're talking about these things.
But it's so intrinsic to the to the world today. The left versus right, all that.
Yes, and then the thing is, what happened is that they got a new manager of content, I think it was, and they started saying that we're going to be pushing this. What they call now, I guess, like, woke agenda. This was back in 2016. And the reason that they were doing it is because they figured out that they could create little miniature revolutions in society. Like if you just focus on gay marriage for a year straight, everybody just starts talking about gay marriage, that becomes the culture war. But the thing is, if you're focusing on gay marriage for a year, you're not focusing on the fact that wages have stagnated. You're not focusing on the fact that Australia doesn't have a climate policy, or that there's a special extinction, or the fact that, like, we are on the verge of a housing collapse. Like, all these things get pushed to the side. What you focus on is gay marriage. Probably the least consequential thing you could be talking about, but that's what all media is focused on. And the reason that they want that focused on it is because it makes it like, as soon as you start having that culture war, banks like ANZ will start coming out with, like, gay TMs and we're so pro-gay, and all these other companies start doing it because it's like a social revolution that's happening that's corporate friendly.
So there are common enemies within the people versus the people who are controlling those people are not ignored then.
No, yeah, it's a classic state of, like, divide and conquer. It's a very old strategy.
So what that means then is they're just very aware of the power of group identity.
They're very... Well, I don't know who is exactly, because, I'm imagining the bankers, they don't really give a shit about their stuff, but there are people that definitely generate what culture is. Absolutely there is. That is a huge reason why Modi... Is that how you say his name in India? Modi.
I should know again. Many Indian
like
references
Modi.
I've just disappointed.
Dropped the ball on.
Yeah.
But, like, a huge reason for why he is so powerful now. He has the entire banking system behind him. In India, he has the media behind him. But he also was the one that started pushing this agenda, because he just realized, India is, 85% Hindu, 15% Muslim. He started really pushing that agenda of just being like, we are a Hindu country. And so it was a genius political move. I don't know why they probably started moving away from it under the Gandhi days or something like that. But it started unifying that 85% of society. So there are people that generate these big cultural narratives. So that's why I'm really interested in your idea that you're thinking about it from the phrase of, like, you're an individual and what cultural narrative should I be attached to?
Well, I'm not saying that's the point. You can't be immune to those group.
I know.
Identities.
I know you can't be immune to it.
But I think I hope you can have some level of control over which ones you value over others, and which ones you can, to some extent, choose to be a part of. So there's certain ones you can't choose to be a part of. Like, I'm Indian, and I can't choose to not be a part of that group identity.
But are you, though? Because I don't see you as like skin tone,
racially, there are, like, genetic group identities that you just can't ignore.
But mimetically, like, culturally, I don't see you as a particularly Indian dude.
Yeah, no, not really.
Yeah.
But that's a different group identity, like Indian culture versus Indian race. They're two different group identities, I would say.
Do you reckon?
Yeah.
So what's the difference then?
Well, because your race is just the
But is that
sort
an
of
idea?
arbitrary genetic factors that determine the way you look.
But is that an identity though, or is that just the way you look?
Well, it is still an identity.
Like, okay, but if you choose it to be an identity, it is. And you know what? I think that's like
Well,
a
this
huge
is when
thing.
we get into discussions. Well, a lot of discussions where what would talk about what the cultural left would talk about, which is how immune can you be to things like your racial identity and your gender identity and whatnot. So I've always said strive to not be a part to move beyond that. But the counter argument to that would be the way society operates, you can't possibly be immune to certain aspects of that racial identity. So, for example, no matter what, if you're black in America, there's going to be certain things that you experience that other people of that same identity will experience. And as much as you say, I'm going to strive to be an individual, it's impossible because there are just certain experiences you can't be immune from.
No, I honestly think that is just pure negative thinking. And I think, like, exactly this point is like put in, is it's just like, look, maybe they might have to strive harder or something like that, but you can change your identity. For instance, when people, like, I think that a classic thing of that, when they're always just saying that, like, black people are just unwarrantedly targeted by the police. Yes, that's probably true. But also, like, dude, like, I don't think that Obama's getting frisked, And I don't think that even if he wasn't Obama, as in the guy that I don't think that he would be, because he'd just be, like, dressed like a lawyer. He was, like, a dude that worked in, I can't remember what field of law or whatever, but, like, he was dressed in a suit and he was walking around the right parts of town.
Sure.
So it didn't look weird, out of place.
Okay, I'm going to be the SJW here, I guess, but and just more so, I agree with you to a certain extent. I think there's a balance somewhere in between there where you should strive to not let any disadvantages of certain group identities get you down, but there are some aspects that you can't ever be completely immune to. So I guess a counter argument to that would be the fact that, well, he would have had to have dressed in a suit and he would have had to have gone through the nice parts of town. And that's not the experience of someone who isn't black. They could still wear, I don't know, baggy jeans and a hoodie or whatever and not have to deal with that.
So don't you think that's insular thinking, though? Because there's also, like, a thing of, like, man, if you see, like, a white dude just dressed in, like, really baggy jeans with, like, one of those gator hats that they have in the South and a loose singlet, you're going to be like, that guy's scary trailer trash.
Sure, okay, but then there are certain ones that are, there are certain statistics that you can't. So, for example, have you ever read Freakonomics?
Yeah.
So when they send in resumes with like stereotypically black names, and overall they weren't, and it was I'm pretty sure they had a fairly substantial sample space. And if they had a black name on the resume, they were less likely to get the interview or something like that.
Right. And I think that is, yes, okay, that is definitely but I think that this is what I'm, like, it's culture, I think, goes deeper than race. So, for instance, if you are saying that, like, I don't know, like, my name's Barry or something like that, you're changing it to be the culture of what America is, like the mainstream part of the culture or whatever, as opposed to if your name's like Shaniqua or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and those people are grown up in that culture, so it's hard to lift yourself out of that culture because that's what you see around you, right? But what I'm saying is that you can shift your circumstances, and a good way is what we're talking about now, is just moving the way that you see yourself. What tribe do you see yourself as? Do you see yourself as a black man, or do you see yourself as a businessman?
100%. I agree with that 100%. You need to not perceive yourself just as that identity, which is in certain circumstances statistically disadvantaged. However, as you said, it is harder for those people to then pull themselves out.
Yeah, but I think that is part of just it's hard for anybody to pull themselves out of their circumstances.
Yeah.
Even if you are an extremely wealthy kid, right? It is going to be hard for you to properly empathize with people from, say, the working class or people in, hood communities and things, right? Because that's what you know.
Yeah.
It's the same thing as that's what they know. But the point is that, what you're saying again is that you don't have to be confined by the cultures that have been assigned to you.
So then, okay, well, if that's, I agree with that, but then how does that then differentiate if that's the rebuttal to the left-wing cultural argument, let's say? How does that then differentiate to the left-wing economic argument where it seems to be very based in class distinction?
Mm.
So what's different then to saying to a minimum wage worker, well, you don't need to see yourself as a minimum wage worker and you can pull yourself out of those circumstances. What's the phrase? Pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I would say to that is that, and it's the same thing when you're talking about someone called Shaniqua that lives in the hood, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about levels of intelligence here. That somebody who is abnormally intelligent is probably going to move up in society because they're going to be able to grasp very complicated ideas and be able to execute them in a way that will be useful to someone that is willing to pay for those skills because it's a rare skill, right? That's usually the way that it's determined, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would say is it's all very well and good to say pull yourself up from your own bootstraps to a certain sector of society based on how intelligent they are, right, and how capable they are of it. But say that somebody has...
Are you saying people from the hood then are not intelligent?
No, I'm saying some people from the hood are intelligent, but it's like every other sector of society, right? There's just some people that are smart and some people that aren't smart.
Yeah.
And so some people that aren't smart are just going to be in the hood for the rest of their life. So the question then becomes, does the rest of society owe something to that sector of society? Now, first of all, I would argue that they do. But the other thing that I would say about when it comes to these minimum wage questions and things is when you're talking about something like minimum wage, it is very different to when you're talking about culture. Because when you're talking about culture and you're talking about people that see themselves as black or people that see themselves as rich or whatever, right? That is kind of just an idea in your head. But when you're talking about economics, that's a measurable, real world circumstance. Mm-hmm. And it's also about utility, right? It's a much more practical way of seeing the world. So when you're saying to, working class, you don't need a minimum wage, what you need to do is become an entrepreneur and move up. That's just not how an economy works. You need people that are serving you French fries. You need farmers, all of these sectors of society. Otherwise, the bankers, how is the banker going to cook anything if they don't have a Jamie Oliver cookbook and shit from Coles? They don't know how to gather that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's all of society needs to be working in a certain way for even people at the top to be in the position that they are, which is actually another reason why Australia has had 30 years of economic growth, right? And a huge part of that was that you were making sure that the working class had a stable amount of money, because they're the people, rich people, when they get money, what they do is they just siphon it off to offshore. But when the working class...
because the argument, again, the counter-argument to that, I know you've mentioned that in other podcasts, because again, the counter-argument to that is, well, they reinvest the money and they build more businesses and whatnot, and they...
Well, look at the statistics. Yes, there's a sugar rush that happens after that there is a tax cut, like what's happening in America at the moment, right? You see this explosion in growth. Mm-hmm. Eventually what happens is that money funnels its way... they'll constantly be talking about, I don't know, say, look at the steelworks that are opening up, this small car dealership. All of these things can work because of tax cuts, right? But what do those businesses do to expand? They siphon their money into banks. Yeah. Now, banks, their only output, I guess, is investing in things. So they are just getting funneled all of this money. Eventually, all that money trickles essentially into banks. And then those money, and a few oil companies and things, right? It's always the same. So then those banks move the money out. And it's just evident in the fact that, say, in America, for instance, up to 50% of the GDP is offshore.
What's the advantage of the banks when you say moving it out? What do they just
avoiding
leave
tax? That's what they're trying to
They
avoid.
put it in tax havens.
They're putting it in tax havens, which makes the society poorer.
Then then the argument would be, we'll lower the corporate tax rate.
But the
So
question,
then there's no incentive then for them to put it
yes, and
offshore.
that is a very complicated economic argument, and you can argue both ways. But what you cannot argue is that these corporations get politicians elected that make it so that they don't follow those tax laws. So, for instance, in Australia, there was 650 companies last year that paid nothing in tax. Huge corporations, so their tax rate is effectively zero. The other huge point is that, like, Singapore has a tax rate of 2.5%. I think Ireland has a 0% tax rate. Do you want to have those societies? If you want to have those societies, move towards that. But if you want to have a society that, say, like Norway, you should have high taxes and you should make sure that there are politicians in power that are actually willing to enforce those laws. Because last year we saw, I think, $650 billion maneuvered offshore. Well, no, sorry, the 650 corporations. So it was like something like $700 billion. That's just in 1 year. $700 billion taken out of the country. That is $700 billion that is not circulating in the economy.
Yeah.
These are huge amounts of money. So this is the difference.
And again, I don't want to get, because we've had a podcast where we've spoken about this sort of stuff.
Sorry.
I just do want to, no, but it is interesting. And
I'm trying to just basically say.
When it goes offshore, and so this 700 billion, it's just going into a tax haven, is it?
Mm.
And it's what by the shareholders of the bank, it's their money, is it? Or is it?
Ostensibly. But is it? At the end of the day...
But what? I just don't know. What's the incentive for this bank then to just... Who is going to get that money? What is it?
Nothing. No one's getting that money.
What do they do?
They're avoiding tax, because if the money's there, then they're going to have to pay, I don't know, 30% of that $700 billion.
But if they're just putting it... eventually are they going to bring it back? Or what are they... They're just leaving like a...
Yes, and that's the huge problem.
Like a treasure chest or something.
Yes! That's what's happening worldwide. This is not just Australia. This is not just America. This is all Western. It's all democracy. Like,
so
it's
you're
everywhere.
telling me there's somewhere where there's just like billions. And
Yeah,
billions
dude, it's like
dollars.
an unbelievable Pirates of the Caribbean amount. Like, just those treasure chests are nothing. That is one cargo ship to them. It's not even a cargo ship. It's just one of those old crap sail ships. We're talking about cargo ships of money. And so the thing is, like, worldwide, this is what's happening. All money is getting siphoned into these tax havens, and it is not building societies. This is what's really scary about these things, because if that money is fluctuating throughout society and you're putting that money into tax, and then those governments can then allot that money into things that are going to build the society. So this is where, like, the question, like, and as opposed to that, it's just sitting there rotting. And it's getting to the point where these companies are so powerful that, like, for instance, like, I've used this example before, and it's just like, the Labor Party said, we should have some of the money from the mining tax because those are our resources. So the people of Australia should be profiting from those resources. It makes perfect sense. That's what Norway did. They have $1 trillion in savings. The mining companies, when they said it was a mild amount, it's not a mild amount, but it was, I think, 40%. They were trying to take 40% of the profits from taxing, from mining companies, right? Mining companies...
It's not a mine. That's a lot of money. It's not a minor amount.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, but you're still getting 60% of the profit of our resources. Yeah, I would argue that we should be getting 100% of it because it's ours. It's not BHP's. This is the Australian crown.
Then that goes back to the idea of private ownership of land, doesn't it? So that the business that bought that particular land owns the profit from that land.
Exactly. Which is, I think, a complete rort. Or, I think that it's not... It shouldn't be that black and white. If you're talking about a nation's natural resources, I strongly believe that nation should be profiting from it. And it's just common sense, really, at the end of the day. Again, what is that money doing instead? It is sitting in an offshore account. What could it be doing? It could be making us one of the educational powers of the world, as opposed to where we are now, which is behind Kazakhstan. It could be giving us world-class hospitals. It could be giving us world-class fire engines so we could actually fight the bushfires. There's an idea.
Yeah.
Like, all of these things it could be invested in.
Okay.
But instead it's just sitting around, rotting.
All right.
Not helping anyone. So that's the whole moral argument to it. But I'm saying that there's like a difference between an economic argument and a cultural argument.
Okay.
Of saying that...
Because I was about to say we could go back and forth on this for a while. And I'm not necessarily like on the other side. I just... Well, one, I'm for the purpose of playing devil's advocate. But two, I'm just interested in questioning some of the assumptions. What I'd be interested in asking you is, do you think relating it back to the idea of group identity, do you think the group identity that you've committed to hasn't allowed you to objectively... well, first of all, it's the common enemy there is that the banks and the 1%.
Oh.
So do you think then you're ever being purely objective in your criticism of them because you have the group identity and they are the common enemy there?
No, and that's a good question, and that's a really good point, and that goes back to my other point, which is that you do not know what reality is. You can only sort of educate yourself and have like a better map than other people would, right?
Sure.
So yes, obviously, my criticisms of the banks, in fact, I would argue that they're too light because I don't know enough of the shenanigans about it, and you ask economists and they'll just go on for hours about the atrocities that they're committing.
Right.
But,
I know nothing, really. So.
But, what I would say is that it's exactly what you were talking about. The aim of politics is what enemy should you be taking shots at?
Okay, so
are you being fair to that enemy? No, they're an enemy, right?
Yeah.
But you need an enemy. That's what you're saying forges identities, and I think you're 100% right about it.
What about, do you think there's some value in the idea of the enemy being more of an abstract thought? So I have my criticisms of religion, for example, but if you say that the enemy is not necessarily a group of actual people, but it's an idea like sin, if sin is the enemy, could that then create in some regards a better society because we're fighting something that is an abstract idea versus actual people?
It's a good question. See, because the fact that you use the word abstract, though, makes me think no. Because I think that what you should be doing constantly is trying to figure out what is real. You shouldn't be trying to get into these ideas. Again, like the idea of
that
left,
abstract thought then becomes real tangible...
becomes real tangible outlines, but what I'm saying is when you think about abstract thoughts, or purposefully abstract thoughts like left, like sin... Yeah. What happens then is that you have an interpreter that interprets to people what that is. So, for instance, when it comes to sin, you have a priest telling you what is and isn't sin, if that's what you're making the common enemy. So they get to decide what it is, and that's just based off of their values. So that I don't know if that's a good idea.
What if you created an ideology where there isn't that... it takes away the middleman of the priest, and it's just the individuals are unified through the group identity, but the common enemy is an abstract idea, like sin, for example. But that's something you fight within yourself.
But do you think that you could without a middleman?
No, I don't know.
I don't know. Dude, I think that yes, someone like you. And I think that it makes a lot of sense when you see your worldview, right? Because obviously you were very good at maths at school. You were very intelligent. You came from a family that clearly valued education and pushing yourself, right? So as a result of that, the way that you see the world...
That's why I'm the Indian group identity, right?
Yeah. But that's a cultural thing, isn't it? I think if you're going to say anything, that would be the difference between cultural and racially Indian. But these are elements that you have taken from that culture,
sure.
Right? And so as a result of that, I think that you see the world as like this thing of like, you can make up your own choices and everyone can think through these things logically. But dude, not everyone does. My biggest case in point to that is Twitter. There's so many idiots in the world, dude. They just look up to a messiah. They have the little messiahs in their heads, So
I don't necessarily believe So do you think I think everyone can truly be individuals and make up their own minds and not have deities? And
I think if you think about it, you realize no, that probably doesn't make sense. But I think that your natural inclination is no, just think about it and make up your own mind and just try and see things in a level-headed fashion, because that's the way that you interpret the world.
Yeah, that's very true, and that could definitely be the case. But when I say something like, what if there's an ideology without the middleman, that ideology itself doesn't necessarily have to be a rational ideology. It can be highly irrational and based on, firing up the emotional engine within the human, which I think is necessary to actually get people passionate about a certain ideology. So
What's an example?
Well, I don't know. That's why I'm saying there isn't one that exists like that. So.
Yeah, look, I think.
But the closest would be something like like a really. If it's someone like an evangelical, but who's also very introspective, because isn't it? I don't know, and I don't know. Look, the Christian people listeners can comment, but as far as I'm aware, the evangelical Christians are the ones that believe like you don't need the hierarchies of the church, and you have a personal relationship with God and Jesus.
No, because man, evangelicals are as hierarchical as it
Yes,
gets.
I know. Then they have
So maybe they propagate
that.
that. Yeah, they might propagate that, but that's not how it works.
No, that's true. So,
but if you're talking about somebody who's not religious but uses those same elements and inspires you, okay, it's pathetic that I'm going to say this, but this is what I genuinely think. I think it is Tony Robbins, dude. I think that's the closest thing to what you're thinking about.
100%.
I agree with you there. Yeah, and the fact that he has that worldview of I am not your guru. Essentially, what he's trying to do constantly is that is his whole shtick, is figuring out what your limiting beliefs are, disassembling those limiting beliefs, and building up a new story in your own mind that pushes you forward. So he's essentially saying what you're saying, and he just kind of just does the practical work of that. So he is that. He would be the closest thing to having like a non-religious evangelical that kind of makes you believe in yourself as opposed to believing in God. That's what he would be doing. Okay. And then, figuring out what your narratives are in your head and trying to figure out which of those he would say are destructive as opposed to constructive, and keeping the constructive ones there, demolishing the destructive ones and replacing them with better beliefs. And I think that is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But
I think someone like Tony Robbins can only exist in the context of the world that we have today as a sort of complementary to the world that we have today. I don't think you can build an entire society on someone like, maybe you can, I don't know.
I don't know, yeah. Can you?
I don't know, potentially.
Yeah, see, that's the whole thing, is that he is building better individuals.
Yeah, and he's tailored his message to the world we have today with its already established group identities. Whereas if he was the pervasive, the main identity in a society, or someone similar to him, I don't think that would work. It could. I don't know. It might.
And he is, the thing is, he's still a man. He is very pervasive to the culture and time that he grew up in, because Tony Robbins, I mean, two things spring to my mind when I think of the 80s. Tom Cruise and Tony Robbins. They're just 80s men that are still balling now. And the worldview that he's...
Greed for instance, is good, man.
Yeah, greed is good. That's how he sees the world. He loves banks, loves CEOs, thinks Reagan was the best president of all time. He has that 80s mentality of how the world is. Yeah. And so he pushes those narratives and cultures. Just like how, and like our generation is kind of defined, I guess, as we were talking about, by The Simpsons and Are You an SJW or Based?
No, our generation, because we've had the boomers are becoming the common enemy. Our generation is defined by the premise that boomers had it easier than us.
Yeah.
But we are also like the second greatest, like we've had the second greatest conditions pretty much ever.
That's not good enough.
And like, damn
Number
boomers,
2.
they had it so much easier.
That's it, man.
Yeah.
I think that's that's kind of the zeitgeist of what's happening now. So I guess the whole question is, and this is what marketing talks about all the time as well, is how do you create cultures? Because man, I don't know if you've had this conversation, but I've had this happen to me so many times where there's some dude in Surrey Hills that shouldn't be dressing the way that he's dressing at his age. It's getting a bit sad, and it's just like, come on.
There's a lot of those guys out there now. By the way, any international viewers or listeners, Surrey Hills is the I wouldn't call it the hipster suburb of Sydney. It's the corporate hipster suburb of
Corporate
Sydney.
hipster suburb of Sydney.
Yeah.
Brooklyn, maybe, at this point. I don't think that's hipster anymore. It's too expensive. It's too gentrified. That's Surrey Hills.
And Brooklyn's not... Is it corporate?
No.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that there would be a lot of those,
It's like
boutique marketing.
True, yeah. It's probably like San Francisco, but a suburb.
Yep. That's Surrey Hills in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, those guys come up to me and talk to me about, I don't know, some like short film idea that they've got or something, or like a, like some branding opportunity or whatever. And so they come up to me and they always say this of just being like, man, how did you do it? How'd you create your culture? Like, you've created your own little mini culture. How did that happen? They're obsessed with that idea.
Really?
Marketers are obsessed with the idea of culture because they understand that that's how you sell things, which is a really perverse way of thinking about it. And I think that that's the reason that I was able to create a culture is because I'm not thinking about how to sell something to them. I've got like higher principles than that, and I think people can kind of sense that.
But inadvertently, you're selling a persona to people.
Yes, but that's the difference.
But
right?
you haven't gone into it thinking I'm here to sell something.
It's not as
But it has happened.
It's not as cynical and self-interested as that.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, in that way, yeah.
And so like it's a really disgusting way to see the world, and maybe you can do it and you can latch onto it. But that is what marketers do. They find people that have generated a culture and then they sell shit to it. Like, dude, the classic example, I guess, is just African American hood culture, which is the epitome of no money. It's an extremely poor, basically a third world country within a first world country. But what do you see? All rich, not anymore, but before, you would see all rich white kids dressing like kids from the hood, or like, gangsters from the hood or whatever, right? And so they had found a culture. Those guys, just because they have so much confidence in themselves, they made crap clothes, like baggy jeans, baggy hoods, cool. And then people with money started clicking onto that.
Yeah, right.
So I think that that's how they exploit those things.
Yeah, they're selling a group identity, aren't they?
They're selling an identity.
You're cool. That's the main thing, isn't it? Oh, how sad. That's it.
So lame.
I'll buy these clothes to be cool. But you're so exposed when you're a teenager.
Yes.
Not now. Although there are a lot of people our age that still fall into that.
Yeah, and it's just like, how introspective do you get? Because otherwise, if you don't start, which is another thing that I'm very, very impressed that you're thinking about that question. I think that is the beginning of that. You are creating, because I was talking about it on my self-help channel the other day. You have the power to create your own identity. So why are you letting society dictate what your identity is? Which is, I think, is that thing that you just have that natural repulsion to. So for instance, where you're just like, kind of like, dude, I'm not really, like, you're just like, look, I'm not really Indian, like you don't see yourself as that really. Like it's something that's sort of there, but it's not like who you are. And it's the same with all these SJWs and things, right? Like they see themselves as a proud woman or whatever. And like, the based ones see themselves as like warriors of freedom, or just hating feminists is their identity. But like, dude, these are really blurry and also, I think, societally assigned roles.
And but I think these people more often than not, in the same way, religion, people who are suffering really attach themselves to religion. The people who attach themselves to the utmost to these sorts of ideologies that you're talking about are people who are suffering and have also felt as though they've been hard done by the other mainstream culture. So if you feel like you don't fit in, or if you're at the bottom of the mainstream human hierarchy, you're very prone to fall into these subcultures because you get a sense of purpose, and it's the same. It's why all these incels are going out killing people, and it's why these like 18-year-old Muslim dudes go and join ISIS because I'm powerful now because I'm not at the bottom of the hierarchy anymore.
Yeah.
There is not much difference in this. I would argue there's not much difference in the psychological makeup of an extreme feminist and an extreme anti-SJW.
No.
They're both
No.
people who are suffering and have latched on to these ideas to
But
give them a sense of power.
Yeah, look, suffering in the Buddhist term, like it's all in their head. I think most of the time. I think, and again,
Yeah.
And so they just kind of.
But that's still a very powerful suffering.
Yeah, well, that's the only suffering they'd argue is just mental.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's just pain. But if you're suffering, it's because you're inflicting it on yourself. And so, yeah, I think that's what's... Yeah, you're so right. That is exactly what that is. But I see that as an extremely narcissistic, stupid, and insular way of seeing the world, as being like, I am a man, or I am a woman.
But that's not gonna... And then this is another thing I know we've talked a lot already, but another thing I wanted to explore is how to get someone out of a group identity that could potentially be dangerous. And when you say things like, and I agree with you, it's a narcissistic and insular way, but that is not going to change them.
No.
That just feeds in. The most powerful of group identities are ones where it's, what is it called? It's not a non-falsifiable ideology, but it's the idea that any criticism or any sort of any opposition to that particular identity feeds into the narrative of that identity. So by you as a man criticizing the extreme feminist, it feeds into the identity like he's a man, therefore
he doesn't know. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the way they're everywhere. It's Israel Folau saying, "Oh, the bushfires were because we legalized gay marriage."
Yeah.
And any tough times is because God is testing me. Well, then people are just going to be like, "You're crazy," and it's like, no, this is just God testing me. It's all of them. Those are the most powerful ones. How do you get someone out of that? Because then, when you say to them, if you just say to them, "This is wrong. You're narcissistic. You've been misguided," that criticism is built into the identity as. That's going to happen when you latch onto this.
They'll come up with a lot of mental defenses.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if anything, it strengthens their attachment to the identity.
Yeah.
So why would they want to go? Because if their previous, like before latching onto this identity was that they were suffering mentally, albeit mentally, then why would they'll do as much mental gymnastics as possible to not have to go back to that state of suffering. So that's an extremely challenging thing, isn't it? How do you actually get people out of extreme ideologies like that?
I think that there's like, look, you yourself you probably don't have the skills. I probably don't have the skills to do that, but I would imagine that certain psychologists, someone like Tony Robbins, that is what he does. He goes to people that are, as part of those, I don't know, gangs or something in like the inner city suburbs of America, and gives them a different story for them to latch onto. But I think that that's what you do. You first go into their world, you understand where they're coming from, and as a result of understanding where you're coming from, you understand where their leverage points are, why they want to be attached to that, why they want to be attached to that identity, what are they getting out of it. And he uses the framework of just being like, there's significance, there's a longing for significance, there's a longing for connection,
power,
there's longing for well, that's significance. That's like these are very broad terms, right? But like, connection, they're looking for stability, they're looking for variety, or they're looking for growth, or they're looking for contribution. Like those are the things, those are the vessels that you have in life, right? So say, for instance, that, I don't know, say some like MRA activist is doing that because he feels that his power has been taken away by women, You have to be able to like understand that is the reason that he is an MRA person, basically because he was like burned by some lost flame in the past or whatever, right?
And by saying to him, "Oh, you're an incel, you're an insecure man," that's not gonna work.
No,
not at all.
No,
and yet that's how that's how sort of mainstream culture that is against all these tribalistic ideologies addresses the issues mostly by insulting the people who have fallen into these ideologies.
Yes,
by saying you're stupid. That's gonna get them out of it.
Well, it depends when you're talking about like on a social level or a personal level, right? Because I think that I implement that a lot in a lot of my YouTube videos, I think that I'm constantly doing that because it's again, it's
You're
that
telling
societal
people
thing.
they're stupid.
You're saying that like, isn't that type of person stupid? Smart people think like this. You're doing that constantly because as you said before, when it comes to politics, you need to identify enemies. So on a broad level, yes, but like when on an individual level, if you tell someone they're stupid, they're just going to retreat more into it. I think that, as a result of that, once you figure out what their leverage point is, back to the MRA guy, I guess, if you were saying that he is the way that he is because he was like burned in the past and he feels like he's lost his power, what you have to do is come up with a story for that guy that is different. Like it's so if, for instance, it's just being like,
And
women didn't take power away from you.
And it
you know?
offers those same vessels that you were talking about. It still has to offer the significance.
Yes.
And the value.
Yeah. So clearly he's motivated by significance in life. So if you just say that, like, if you explain that to him in a way that hits his vessel. So you say, for instance, that like you constantly talking about women ruining your life means that women are ruining your life. Like in your head, you have given your power to them, and then that guy will sit there and he'll just be like, "Well, I don't want my power taken away." And so then you just say that, like, so what you actually do is you just, get on with life and you get a job instead of complaining all the time and living at your parents' house.
Does that still... That sounds quite... Not to... I'm sure you've probably experienced success with that strategy, but it sounds a bit simplistic. Just saying to him, oh, that one little... point that you're giving women power by complaining about them, therefore stop doing it. Is that really going to help someone who's really immersed in that ideology?
Well, as always, it depends how immersed they are, but I will say this. After 9/11, the FBI took one guy into custody who was a connection to Al-Qaeda and was organizing 9/11. And he was known as a hard nut zealot in the 9/11 community, hated Americans, absolutely despised them. And when he went to America, he didn't obviously contact any other Americans. He was just staying in his apartment block, orchestrating these things. When the FBI took him in, he was fully expecting that... first of all, I'll just say this, that they gave him cookies. And he said, like, I can't eat cookies. And they're like, oh, yeah, we know you're, like, not lactose intolerant. I mean, you're lactose intolerant, so these ones don't have milk in them or whatever. And then he broke down and cried because he realized that, like, he had orchestrated all this suffering and infliction and all the things that he was learnt about Americans was kind of a lie. Like, Americans are kind of just, they're all different people, right? They're not like this one enemy that he was like conditioned to think back in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia or whatever. And he saw that in that one act, there was like an act of kindness there. Where
so you got to show that. So if you're part of the common enemy, you got to show you're not the enemy.
You have to show that you're not the enemy in some way, obviously. Yeah. You have to be able to diffuse them and know that you're trying to understand their world. That is 101 what interrogators do. They try and establish that they're there to, like, just not even help, because that's even patriotic, like patronizing or whatever. They just want to, like, see what you're about. That's where you start it from, right? But the thing is that, like, there is a leverage point. There is a reason that people believe a certain narrative or belong to a certain culture. There is usually a fulcrum, just this one piece that if that goes, a lot of the other like infrastructure goes down, right? There's like one pinpoint reason that, like, they've latched on into their head for whatever reason, and that's why they see the world that way.
Has there, for you personally, has there been any narratives that have been damaging for you that you've managed to get yourself out of?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it was because of self-help books, but it was back when I was 19 or whatever, or 18, and I was just like at university. I hated my degree. I hated not doing anything creative anymore, and as a result of just being in that degree and just hanging around a bunch of people that wanted to be bureaucrats when they graduated, and they were just very grey people, and I wasn't used to that coming from a performing arts school. I was used to a lot of being around a bunch of energetic, creative people, I guess. And so, like, I hated that world, and I was kind of just resigned to that is how my life is going to turn out. And so as a result of that, I started to become grey and boring like bureaucrats. And as a result, as I told the story a million times, then I picked up a Tony Robbins book that was just in the library, and then it was just like, you can create your own life. And that completely shifted it. It was just like, it never occurred to me until that point. And that's what most people are, like you said, when you're a teenager. You're kind of just this leaf in the wind of whatever like circumstances you are a part of.
Yeah, you're a sponge, man.
You're a sponge. But if somebody just even, like, see, that one fulcrum completely changed my life. It was just like, no, you decide what your life is. From the ground up, you can design your entire life.
Yeah.
From the absolute basis of just like little teeny beliefs to where you're going, all of that is up to you.
Yeah. Interesting.
Do you think that you have one? Sorry, I know that it's getting late and we should probably go.
Yeah, I would have had plenty. One that we spoke about in the previous podcast, which was definitely the narrative that it's a value structure, really. So I would have valued being a mainstream comedian / actor above what I was doing. And you change. Yes, the I don't know if there was a specific point that I could call the fulcrum which changed that. But it was a sort of cumulative effect of actually experiencing the mainstream industry for what it was, and saying that it's not all it's cut out to be. It's very much an example of the grass seems greener, and nothing seems greener than being a famous comedian per se.
Yeah.
And then there've been other ones, like I would say I did have a pretty incel mentality when I was younger. I didn't have a lot of success with girls in high school, and I'd always put that down to I'd never take personal responsibility for that. I always be like, it's because I'm Indian.
Yeah.
It's because I'm short. It's because I'm Indian. It's because I'm short. Always those two things. It's because I'm Indian. It's because I'm short. It's because I'm Indian. It's because I'm short. And the crazy thing about an ideology like that is you can find statistics that confirm that belief, because I have a stand-up joke about that. When it comes to dating preferences online, Indians are like the least favored. So sad. And I kind of, God, sending, hey baby, please send bobs and vagin. That's not going to help.
No.
But then I just use that statistic. You can always find statistics that suit that fit your narrative. In fact, that's what all not only just the SJW culture, but a lot of the subcultures we see today that find value in their undue suffering. They're just nitpicking certain statistics. So I'd be like, well, yeah, see, like it's not my fault. And and the height thing, I mean, that goes without saying. Yeah, women don't like short men. But then I came to realize, and it was a long process, but you come to realize those things do have an effect, but it is so minor compared to
what is in your circle of influence.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And you can change that by, as you said, creating your own narrative.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes if you've had a negative narrative for an extended period of time, I would say you can even counterbalance that by giving yourself an opposing narrative to that. So this sounds super lame, but yeah, you just give yourself affirmations like, I'm a charismatic, high-value male, all just sort of things like that, which sounds stupid and it sounds ridiculous. But that is the sort of thing that you need to implant into your subconscious, which will get you out of that victim narrative.
Yep.
You need to tell yourself that you're not a victim.
Yeah. And and you know what else as well? It is very obvious in your psychology that that's the place that you're at now.
That's
Even
why I
just
say
the
I'm
way
a
that
9
you
out of
present
10.
yourself.
Yeah,
Huh?
that's why I'm a
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10 happiness. That was in the previous podcast, but...
No, and I think that that's true, actually, and I see that with you as well. Like, I remember that about myself when I was very into these ideas, and now it's kind of just a faded memory. Well, it's still there, but it's just because I'm not focusing on it as much anymore. But no, now that you see it, you actually do see that you're living the principles, and that's why you're internally just very content with life, I think, is because, again, that has become your culture.
Yeah. Yeah, make your own narrative.
So, yeah, it's cool, man. Like, it's actually a really interesting thing to think about. But honestly, see, look, Just before I go, that is what I'm saying is like what I find so important about that mainstream media narrative is the fact that exactly what you just said it yourself, right? You were enamored by mainstream culture because that is such a powerful influence in society. It really is, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtains. It determines what is a thing and what isn't a thing, or at least that's what we used to think, and now like we've realized that that's YouTube. But we grew up in that mainstream society, right? Which is exactly what I see with boomers all the time. They just have all these mainstream talking points, but the fact that I delve deeper and I look into policy and I have statistics to back up what I'm saying, I give my audience statistics to disarm those mainstream media talking points, and you will see it over and over again in comments, them just repeating the statistics that I said, and they just best those talking points that they have, because they're just crocks of shit. They're just very surface level crap talking points, right?
Sure.
So it's like this constant thing of like, I really like thinking of it that way, of just like disassembling what that mainstream media narrative is and how can you help create a new culture.
Definitely.
I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, and I just want to add as a further concluding remark, I think if there was any piece of advice that we could give the listeners and viewers, it's be as introspective as you can and try to work out what are the group identities you belong to. And then, as much as you objectively can, try to figure out how are they serving you. Are they serving you better than certain other ones, or are they serving you in an adverse way? Especially look at the ones that if there's a narrative that's painting you as a victim, really try to rid yourself of that as much as possible.
Yeah.
And again, I guess that is a boomer talking point. Like, don't be a victim, hey.
No, but it's true.
But it is, like, it's very true.
Like a lot of these cliches, there's a lot of wisdom to them.
Yeah, it's very, very true. You're not a victim. You are beautiful and powerful. You're amazing. You're strong. You can be whatever you want to be.
Yeah, all good gems of wisdom.
Yeah.
Although it does make me feel slightly uncomfortable, like hearing that and agreeing to it, but it's true. All right. Well, yeah, I guess let's go.
We'll wrap it up there. That was a good one. That was a very good one.
Sick.
All right. See you guys next time.
Bye.
Subscribe.
Later.